Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the latest edition of Free Thought Hour. This is a show where we have a guest and we grill them. And I've got a really good victim for our grilling this week. But first of all, welcome Tercia, who has had difficulties down in South Africa, where there's all sorts of shortages of electricity and connectivity going on. But here she is, wrapped up for the winter. Why haven't? Oh, there you are. How the devil are you, Tercia?
Well, don't say that we have all sorts of troubles, because then you will make me disappear again, because it seems that's what happens.
Don't do
I'm
that.
well, thank you. I'm much better than I was last week. This time I wasn't sick, but we moved house, and because I keep a little homeschool center in my house, I had to move the school as well, and we now have almost 13 learners. So I've had two moves in 2 weeks. And I'm still surrounded by boxes, although I've emptied most of them and unpacked.
Well, I sympathize wholeheartedly because I so hate moving. I haven't done it for 50 years.
I don't mind parts of it. It's actually quite nice to pack and unpack and repack and see what you have and throw things out. And we did relocate to a fantastic old house. I told you the last time that I was on with you that I feel as if I walked onto a Jane Austen movie set, which I love. I just need the dress that goes with the movie and the figure. If anybody has a figure, Jane Austen Regency figure that I can borrow with a dress, please just inbox me.
I'm not going there, I'm afraid. What you mean is an old house by South African standards. You don't mean as old as our house, which is dated back at least to 1780.
No, it's not that old, but it's probably more than 100 years, which is old in South African standards.
Yeah. Okay.
So, yes, I love it.
Yes. Anyway, let's introduce our guest, Faizal Ali. How the devil are you?
I'm quite fine, thank you. Very good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, it's a pleasure because you are a very interesting guest. You're a psychiatrist at a hospital in America.
Canada.
I don't know where. Oh, Canada. I beg your pardon. Toronto. Yes.
Toronto.
Yes. My apologies. Yeah.
No problem.
And you also do a bit of teaching, I believe. Is that right? You're an assistant professor at.
I work at a teaching hospital, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, which is a big hospital that specializes in psychiatry and mental illness. By virtue of it being a teaching hospital, everyone there has an academic position of some sort. And I mostly do clinical work, but I do some supervising of trainees, residents, and so forth. So yeah, a bit of teaching. But the major thrust of my work is clinical. I treat primarily people with schizophrenia at an outpatient clinic, and then I also have a small private practice outside of the hospital. Where I see more what's called general psychiatry patients. And so that's what I do during my days.
Things, not the surgery side of things, I guess.
No, that my father does that, and he's still he's just recently stopped doing surgery, even though he's in his mid-80s. So he's still actively doing clinical and research, but he's only now put down the scalpel, only recently in a couple of years.
Fantastic. Yeah. What a career.
Very.
So can you tell us, for the benefit of our audience, exactly what psychiatry is? Because there's a lot of gray areas going on here at the moment. There's neuroscience, neurology, psychology, and it's to the uninitiated, it can be a bit confusing.
Yeah, so a psychiatrist is a special medical specialist. So you would have gone through medical school and learned surgery and learned all about all the systems of the body and all the various illnesses. And then you will specialize in particularly the mental illnesses. So those may be depression, anxiety, psychosis like schizophrenia and other psychotic illnesses, addictions, any of the mental disorders. And you will bring your medical training to bear on that. So there is there is overlap between other treatment, other disciplines like psychology, where you will use it's primarily psychotherapy. We will do that as well, but we're sort of, this distinction between the two is not very rigid. But I think by virtue of having the medical training, a psychiatrist is generally more inclined to utilize biological interventions such as medications or things like that, or might rule out if there is someone who has a medical illness that is presenting with symptoms of a mental illness. So yeah, people always ask you what's the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist, and
whereas a psychologist doesn't often prescribe. Is that right?
They won't be allowed to prescribe. They're not licensed to prescribe, at least here in Canada. But it's not to say that there are not psychologists who are very skilled in. I often get referrals from some psychologist colleagues who will say, this person has major depression or panic disorder. I think they need this medication. Could you kind of assess them, confirm this, and prescribe the medication and follow them for that while I continue to do my work with them? So that's a pretty common scenario I will deal with.
Faizal, should I say doctor? I feel I should say Dr. Ali.
Say Faizal. That's fine.
Faizal, I want to ask you, thank you for that very good explanation. I want to ask you whether there's any psychiatric conditions that we have the ability yet to diagnose, I don't want to use the word empirically, but with something similar or something equivalent to a blood test, for example. So are there any psychiatric diseases that we can diagnose in that way? What would the best word to be to say something like a blood test, where you can draw blood or you can do a brain scan?
So an objective test, like where you can say, if your blood sugar is 5.4, you're pre-diabetic. If it's 6.1, you're diabetic, that kind of thing. Basically, no, there isn't. So the diagnoses are based on symptoms and presentations. You talk to the patient, you assess them, you observe their behavior. And then there are standardized systems where you can sort of, at least to make sure that we have some degree of reliability and consistency, so that someone there says major depression, at least there's a good chance that there would be agreement on whether that's the case or not. It's very much a work in progress. I mean, that's sort of the dream, I think, for some people anyway, that we will someday be able to do a blood test or a brain scan or a genetic test or something, and say, there is some degree of like genetic testing, which is not so much diagnostic, but sometimes we will see that someone is more likely to tolerate or respond to one medication versus another, based on how they metabolize the medication. You can tell by some certain genes if they're going to metabolize it very fast, and you need to give them a higher dose. There's that, but there are certainly anomalies and variations that seem to be present in various biological systems, the brain and so forth. So that, for instance, with schizophrenia, if you were to examine the brain scans, like PET scans or MRI scans or whatever, and compare them to the general population, you can see some general differences that indicate that these are brain diseases. I think that's not so much controversy about that anymore. But it's not to the point where you can say, okay, does this person have schizophrenia? Okay, I'll put him in the MRI machine. Okay, there they are. They have it. So, so it's kind of like within on average, someone with schizophrenia might have these particular findings, but it's not to the point where you can say, okay, with this you have it, with this you don't.
Yeah, such a good question, Tercia. It
Yes.
seems to me that
Questions are always don't really have an answer. So
yes, unfortunately, yeah. It seems to me, though, over the last 100 years, psychiatry has been progressing away from the original vague opinion sort of thing to actual objective diagnoses. Is that right? Would you say?
that's one of the changes that have happened in terms of yeah, systems of diagnoses, more reliable, trying to come up with
Mm,
diagnoses that are based on things as much as possible that
mm,
you can be objectively or at least reliably
yeah.
assessed. Um, I am a psychoanalyst, actually. Sometimes I think of myself as a lapsed psychoanalyst, which is the old school, you know, Sigmund Freud, what happened, tell me about your mother, lie down on the couch kind of thing. I did training in that as well.
Uh-huh.
I don't, you know, I'm sometimes I wonder. I think it's a very effective hermeneutic
Mm,
discipline. The scientific evidence for efficacy, it's certainly there. It's certainly there.
yeah.
But in terms of supporting the theories, it doesn't seem to be like if you have a Freudian versus a Kleinian versus some other school of analysis, you don't find that there's really a difference in terms of outcomes. So whether all these very elaborate philosophical ideas of the human brain mind and how human beings work, which are very different and arouse great controversy and argument between the various schools, whether any of them is more true than the other. That's the you know, I think, you know, the whole question right now is whether the whole enterprise has any scientific validity at all, and I think that's still very much an open question.
Yeah. The
But
thing is that there is definitely some sort of interaction between the brain and the body. And
yes.
to that extent, we are suggestible. So we can be told to get better. And,
Yeah.
in
Oh, yeah. Like, I don't want to give the impression that I think, like, certainly, like you say, there has been, on the one hand, a greater understanding of which biological interventions, primarily medication, but also things like ECT. And now there are also some more therapies that, use magnetic stimulation of the brain. There's also some more
Mm,
recent work looking at
yeah.
anti-inflammatories and whether you decrease inflammation in the brain, if that can also help. There's some very fascinating work on nutrition and your gut flora, and that by changing the food you're eating, you can
Yes.
have, or even like an extremely, there is a treatment that's now being looked at as fecal transplantation. You basically take the poop out of you replace the
Yes.
bad poop, get an
Yes.
infusion of good poop, and that seems to
Yes.
work for some
Yes.
people because the neurotransmitters in your brain actually start in the gut. There are certain bacteria
Mm, mm,
that will break down foods and cause certain chemicals to be in your gut, which will then be absorbed, and then they'll go through the rest of your body, including your brain. Um,
mm.
so biology is not
Is not.
just pills anymore, but
No.
also I think there's an increasing, like I did sort of badmouth psychoanalysis there a few minutes ago, but there are lots of other talk therapies, psychotherapies that do have
Yes.
pretty good scientific efficacy
Yes.
studies. Cognitive
Yes.
therapy, behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy,
Mm,
and the interesting thing, which I think you're sort of hinting at there, is that we can show, like, if you give someone a pill, like you have someone with a whatever disease, anxiety disorder, depression, give them you scan their brain, you give them a course of treatment, you scan their brain again, they're better clinically, their brain is different. You can see the same kind of thing with a psychotherapy. So someone has an anxiety
mm,
disorder or depression, you do a course of psychotherapy, they're better. You scan their
mm.
brain before and after, and you see
Mm.
similar changes in the brain as well.
I
So
see. Very interesting.
So the whole dichotomy between psychological mind body, it's messier and messier, and all the time, but in a good way.
Yeah. Tercia, do you want to come
Yes,
in here, or can I carry on?
I wanted to just make a very silly dad joke and say, so the idea that we have a gut feeling is not entirely preposterous. I always find these things funny because it seems that the ancients and colloquialisms might have more hidden in them than we sometimes think. But then I want to ask about psychoanalysis, because some time ago we had Professor Mark Solms on our show, and who lives not far away from me, in fact. And so the idea of psychoanalysis had gone out of favor, but it seems that there are more and more psychiatrists and neurologists who seem to be digging back into old Dr. Freud and finding some value. So the one thing that I want to ask you about, because I mean psychoanalysis can go really deep, but I want to ask you about dreams. Do you ever, when you consult with patients in psychiatry, do you ask them about dreams? Do you think that dreams could give any insight into mental conditions?
I certainly do. Partly it happens without my asking, because patients kind of have this idea that, okay, you're going to see a shrink. Talking about dreams is one of the things you do. It's a little tricky. It's a little hard. I can't say I'm really great at it. I tend to just sit and listen to what the patient says. And what's really interesting is not usually, like, it's not like there's a cookbook. I mean, some people say, okay, so if you dream about your teeth falling out, it means this. If it's more interesting what happens. The patient will recount the dream. And I find the best approach is to listen and see what comes next. Sometimes they'll tell you a dream and then they'll say something that seems not related to the dream, but that's the key to the dream, because it's very, like, you have to understand what the element in the dream means,
to
them. Yeah, like
yes.
there may be, like, you might have a dream about a flashlight and who knows what that means, but maybe there's some very important memory tied to a flashlight, that he lost it as a kid and his dad got mad at him, or who knows, right? If you just say flashlight means this, you're not going to know. But for him, he'll say, you say flashlight. What, when you there's a flashlight was very important in that dream, what comes to mind? And they'll just, oh, well, I remember,
He's got some historic experience in which a flashlight appeared. So he's making a link there which may not be relevant. But anyway, I've got a whole list of things that I want to talk to you about.
What about me, John? What about my list? You didn't consult with me before.
I've only just got this going, this piece of paper here. But I wanted to mention placebo, because you said something about well, I think it was me. I came up with the statement that there's an interaction between the mind and the body, and you sort of endorsed that. And I want to ask about placebo, because it works, doesn't it, to a level that's small and not
so
adequate.
You have to account for it in any treatment study you're doing. You have to figure out a way to exclude that from your results, and sometimes that's very tricky, but it's very crucial. Like if you
So the thing about it is, it's not sufficiently effective, is it? But in the case of conditions which cannot be treated in any other way, what about giving those patients placebo? Is that unprofessional?
Unethical? Is it unethical? I think that's the
yeah. I guess one of the cornerstones of treatment is consent, and you want the patient to know what you're doing. You want to be open, So if you want to, if you're saying, I'm giving you this really powerful pill, just don't take much of it, because it'll, you might die because it's so potent. and it's really just a sugar pill, you're kind of you're not doing that. You're not informing them.
That's exactly what homeopathy is about, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
According to homeopathy,
there is the placebo effect. It's not 100%. It certainly happens, but whether the placebo is causing it, or whether this is just the random noise that you're dealing with all the time, that with lots of illness that people, and there's limits. Like a placebo is not to regrow a limb. Like it's going to do things that it's not usually going to get rid of a metastatic cancer, but it might make you feel less pain from the cancer.
It doesn't do magic.
Put it this way, I've never. But on the other hand, you are always using the placebo. Whether you want to use it or not, there is always,
Even when you're administering an effective treatment, you are, by administering it, introducing this mental concept that they are being helped.
Yeah.
But what interests me about the sorry about that. About the placebo is that, as far as I know, it's not yet fully understood how it works. That relationship between the mind-body interaction, because and as far as psychiatric medicine is concerned, I've also read academic articles that have proven that in many cases, for many patients, the active medication works as well as placebo, especially with certain conditions. I can't cite the papers that I've read. It's been a while, but I know that it is a real thing, that there's a discussion among psychiatrists.
You don't get, I guess, you have to, there's always individual papers. Most of the kind of meta-analyses still tend to show these medications work, and certainly very strongly for antipsychotics and antidepressants. Yes. But there are studies that come out and say we try to make really sure that there was no way they could possibly know, what medication, like a medication that causes side effects that you would expect from antidepressant, but doesn't. And there's sometimes you find that the efficacy diminishes or isn't found at all. So,
John, can I? The question that I want to ask now is, I'm asking you, John. It might take up a considerable amount of time. So, if you're all right with it, I want to.
I'm retired. I'm not in a hurry.
Okay, great. But I'm sure, John, having kids and young persons in your household, you might also find this question relevant. So Faizal, I'm a teacher, and I enjoy teenagers, especially with hot sauce and custard. That goes down really well.
So you're gradually beyond the baby eating stage. You're a real gourmet.
No, I go in for the tougher meat. Grind on the tougher bones.
Yes,
I find them.
Flavor develops with age, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I do find them more challenging, and I always like a challenge. A baby is just 2 or 3 bites and it's over and done with. But on a very serious note, so I work with teenagers, and my own youngest is still a teenager, and my older 2 kids are I think they're also still teenagers in their 20s. But the question I want to ask relates to wondering, in the past 5 years, with the internet being accessible to just about everybody, and especially young people, having access to doctor would have access to in some ways. So that's the first thing, that young people have access to information that they won't have had access to even 10 years ago. And you have anybody can go onto YouTube and make a video about what it's like to live with schizophrenia, and a TikTok video about depression and anxiety. That's the first thing. So kids have access to this. Couple that with the fact that being a teenager is hard. I think most of us have forgotten by the time we're 28 or 38 that being a teenager is a time of angst and a time of insecurity, no matter how secure one's family life is. It's not nice. I just have to go back to my diaries that I wrote when I was 16, which I still have, by the way. And I'm wondering about the second element that plays into this is the fact that mental disease has become much more acceptable than it was in the past. So the stigma is much diminished. So in the past, if you said that you went to see a counselor or a psychiatrist, you wouldn't say that because people would say you're mad. But nowadays, it's almost a badge of honor to say, oh, I'm going to see my psychiatrist. And I'm wondering, especially with teenagers, does this make a psychiatrist's job harder in making diagnoses? Because I've had conversations with kids. I mean, I'm not making any kind of diagnosis ever with any child, but I've had teenagers say to me, ma'am, I think I might be bipolar. And I'm too scared to say this to my mom. And then I see things like they self-harm and that they get anxiety attacks. And what would you say as a psychiatrist? How easy I'm worried that kids, teenagers especially, go through the angst of being a teenager, see things about diagnoses, and begin to act what the diagnosis is that they see a TikTok or a YouTube video about, and then sort of self-manifesting those symptoms, because I have noticed that, or I'm afraid sometimes, that amongst high schoolers especially, doing self-harm or being anxious, it's not something to be embarrassed about. It's almost as if you don't.
Badge of honor. Yeah.
It's almost, that's what makes you part of the in crowd, you know. So what would you say to that?
What she's talking about here is the medicalization of normality, which has only become available in the 21st century. Back in the Victorian times, you didn't have anybody to go and tell your angst to, so you got on with it. And you can't. Nowadays, I've got teenage daughters as well, and they can go to the internet and see what the symptoms are, and then act them out.
Mm-hmm. To be honest, I don't know if I have a really informed answer to that. I don't know if we're seeing like people presenting or taking on. I have to be honest, I don't really have a good answer for that. I think there certainly is some good documentation of contagion of certain things, like for instance, how certain behaviors, like you're talking about self-harm, and that can be sort of become socially reinforced. And of course, social reinforcement doesn't just happen between your friends in school anymore. It happens it could become this huge community online. So I think certainly that happens. Whether actually people take on an illness or will want to, I don't, to be honest, I don't know if I've thought about that enough to really say anything informative. I don't know if it's even just applies to psychiatry either. Like, I think it's one of the things that most of my medical colleagues say is that when a new patient is coming on, they're kind of coming in waving. They've already consulted with Dr. Google, and they're already pretty sure what their diagnosis is, treatment they need, and they just say, here's, could you please write me a prescription for this, because I know this is what I need, and I'll be on my way. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, I wonder whether this goes back to the 1960s when Beatlemania became a contagion, and it was fashionable for girls to scream at concerts and faint. It's the same sort of thing, but just not so weird, not so medicated, as it were.
Yeah, it's and the other thing, the whole thing with I mean, there is the very social media, and the devices themselves are actually they're not just passively conveying information. They are actually having direct effects on our mental health. I mean, they're, the whole idea.
Yes, the algorithms give you more of what you've shown you want.
These kind of very quick little intense dopamine hits that are very difficult to get, and then just kind of craving that, getting more and more of that, and then just kind of knowing, I mean, I think we all, I mean, I'm certainly, in terms of your other previous, your usual, I mean, we know that the problem of the internet, the promise of the internet was that everyone will have information at their fingertips, and that is certainly what's happened. The problem, much of it, if not most of it, is garbage information. So we're not more informed. We just have more things in our head that we believe to be true. So,
yeah.
Well, perhaps if you think about this, let it lie for a bit. Maybe it's a nice topic for one of your students to do some empirical research about. So,
I'm sure
it's something that
it's not. Yeah, I don't want to say stuff because.
Absolutely, but it's something that as a teacher working with teenagers, this is anecdotal, I know, but many teenagers are on medication for anxiety and depression, and it's almost like is it a case that we've become better at diagnosing it, or are we medicating normal? And something that I've been wondering about recently.
I think I don't think there's a consensus on that. I think there is, there's always, prescriptions are going up, and yet the number of people who have illness and are not treated is still unacceptably high in most cases. So it's a strange thing. And I mean, I still see my folks that I primarily work with, the really severely and chronically impaired people with schizophrenia and so forth, they're still not really part of the discussion. I mean, when we talk about mental health, and not to trivialize this as all like the kind of mental health crisis that came as a part of COVID and anxiety and things like that going up. That not what my folks are mostly dealing with. They're just dealing with very
well, would you I don't know if John has anything else, but please tell us about schizophrenia. If John doesn't have anything else, because that's your field of expertise, and it's something that I think we have many misconceptions about. I mean, we have the horror movie serial murder type idea, many of us. So, John, unless you have anything else,
I've got lots of other things, but nevertheless, pursue this one. It's interesting.
So schizophrenia, I mean, the main, it's what classified amongst what's called the psychotic illnesses. So this is where people, the core, there's kind of two, I guess, three elements and dimensions of the illness. One is sort of reality, the ability to discern reality, so that you will start to hold beliefs, paranoid beliefs or grandiose beliefs that aren't true. The CIA is hacking my computer, whatever, those kinds of things. I'm Jesus, I'm a god or something. Or hallucinations, usually voices, but sometimes visual, where you'll be hearing voices or seeing things that aren't really there. So that's one element. The other element is what are called the deficit symptoms, where you just that's more of like an executive function deficit, where you, in order to kind of the usual sort of planning and realizing outcomes or the results of your actions, kind of planning through a day, I got to get up, I got to brush my teeth, and I got to get dressed and so forth. That's not, those things are not really there. So people with schizophrenia, sometimes you can get rid of all their delusions, all their hallucinations, functions, but they're still not able to work. They're still not able to live independently because these other functions, and those tend to be the more disabling ones because they don't really respond well to biological treatments, and by their very nature, they make it very difficult to treat them by psychological interventions. And then the other one is sort of related, but there are also deficits. Like the old-fashioned name for schizophrenia was dementia praecox, which translates as precocious dementia. And I think in recent decades, we've come to realize, oh, that's actually a pretty apt name for some of the aspects of it, that there is difficulty in just the cognitive functions that also happen. So, that's in a nutshell what this disorder is. We can
so what you've got there is, on the one hand, it's people who cease to have a grasp on reality enough to take care of themselves, and on the other hand, you've got these sort of people who imagine that they're superhumans and can achieve unrealistic outcomes.
Right. Or, I mean, that's just one aspect. Sometimes it's granted, but sometimes it's paranoid, and sometimes it's, so those sometimes, I mean, it's one of these issues, like are people with schizophrenia more prone to violence than other people? And it seems no, that's not the case. But the problem is that in our popular imagination and in our perception, it is associated, because I mean, that's one of the rare times someone with schizophrenia is going to make the news, if he goes and pushes someone in front of a subway car or something like that. And also, when they do commit violence, it's very random, and it's something that's likely to get to the news because it's, again, just some random attack, like some innocent stranger pushed in front of a streetcar for no reason. Bizarre and disorganized kind of attack, as opposed to the everyday violence that just happens.
Is it safe to say that? I was going to ask, is it safe to say that most schizophrenic violent tendencies are directed towards the person themselves?
Certainly, they're more likely to suffer from their illness than to cause suffering from their illness. So yeah, suicide is very much elevated. Deliberate suicide, or just by misadventure. The lifespan of someone with schizophrenia is much reduced compared to the to the general population. Partly that's the illness, but also because, by virtue, again, of their deficits, they generally tend to live rather impoverished lives. And we still, in our society anyway, we still don't really have a good approach to how we deal with the significant percentage of our folks who just aren't able to carry on through their lives without a lot of assistance. We kind of give them a very sub-poverty level of money, and say, okay, you're on your own. There's shelters out there. Try to figure out which ones you can go to, and
that would be difficult for a normal person, let alone one suffering.
I remember we sometimes have hearings, like when people have to be in hospital involuntarily, and the patient will have a lawyer. And I remember there was one issue that had to do with the patient's money, and the lawyer kind of asked me, but in all honesty, this person has to live on, $700 a month. That's very difficult. It's in a doctor. And I said, I wouldn't be able to last a week for sure.
No, indeed.
Sorry, just
so what's the difference
down on here? So sorry about that jar there.
What's the difference between schizophrenia and bipolar?
So bipolar is it's classified under a mood disorder. So the primary problem there is of your mood. So the bipolar disorder and major depression are the two primary mood disorders. Depression is just, as it says, persistent, low, sad mood, but not just like having a bad day, but just very, again, not just where you're stuck in this very, very low, sorrowful
Yeah.
mood for weeks on end. You're not eating, you're not sleeping. You may have suicidal
Mm,
thoughts and actually attempt
mm,
suicide.
mm.
And then bipolar disorder is where you might have episodes like that, but you might also have episodes in which your mood is abnormally elevated, so that
Yeah.
you, again, grandiose thoughts, you're sped up, you're not sleeping, you're constantly doing things but not in a really organized and productive way.
Mm.
And they tend
Hyper.
to be, yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk to you about the issue that where we recently bumped into each other
Oh, yeah.
on Matthew Sabatine's thread in
Yeah.
Facebook, because we had Matthew on the show a couple of weeks ago,
Oh, okay.
and he's an interesting person because he's gone from being raised in atheism to becoming briefly an atheist, and now
Right.
he's gone back to being a Christian, and
Yeah.
so he's posting stuff about the mind-brain relationship, and he proposes that it's a single, not a single. He wants
Right.
it to be a dual,
Yeah.
with a discontinuity between the brain and the mind.
Yeah.
He wants the mind to be a separate thing, which might be called a soul, and which
Yeah.
can
Yeah. I think,
continue.
yeah, that's, I mean, yeah, I mean, if I were a proponent of that particular view, I would just come out and say, yeah, soul, like that's what I'm talking about. Now, what that soul is, but that's what I'm saying, that there's, yeah, anyway, go on.
Yeah, well, I'm not in that school of thought.
Yeah.
I think personally, and this is only my opinion, I don't have any expertise or qualifications in this matter
Here's
at
the
all.
dirty
But
secret. No one has expertise in this particular question.
no,
No one.
that's right. Yes. So I'm bringing a retired science teacher's perspective to the activity, and I think that the mind is what the brain does, in the same way as contraction is what a muscle does.
Okay.
And I've got some what I take to be supporting evidence from Steven Pinker on this, because I attended a lecture by him and I made notes, and here they are. I'm going to screen them for us. And so the idea is that there's no reason for us to doubt that the brain can't handle the mind, that it's not capable of doing minding things, you know. So, and here's the list. It's because the brain is an electrical device, and there's 4 strands of evidence for that: brain surgery, disabled patients with electrodes implanted, magnetic stimulation, transcranial TMS, you know, and functional nuclear magnet fMRI. So there's that, and then also the brain is a chemical device. We know that drugs can influence it and modulate mood, like we were just saying about depression, you know, or bipolar. There's some drugs that are very effective at controlling that. And then external or internal injury that damages part of the brain can damage the mind, you know, and eventually brain surgery also shows the same sort of results in terms of mind ability. And then if you measure the complexity of the brain, it's easily got enough units to handle the components of consciousness, whatever that is. And then organization, we know that some of the bits of the brain are arranged like the gates, the electronic gates in a computer. So, I mean, we can see this particularly in the optic system, where there are structures that actually recognize edges, and we can study the live brain nowadays without damaging
Yeah.
it, and reconstruct the images that it is apparently forming from its eyes.
Yeah.
And then, of course, finally, when the brain dies, the
Yeah.
person is gone. So it seems to me that that's quite strong evidence that mind is what the brain does. What do you think?
There, I mean, you're preaching to the choir here. I mean, that's the, I mean, I don't know if I would feel confident that, okay, let's see if we can play devil's advocate here, because I think we're all
Okay.
physical or leading that way, I presume. I'm not sure if Tercy hasn't laid her cards on the table yet, but we'll see.
I'll do that sooner or later.
Well,
Every time.
So let's so what can you say counter to that? What do the people who say the mind is something other than the brain? There may be some relation to it between the two, but it's not. So you'll always hear this reference to me to what's called the hard problem.
yeah.
And this is a term coined by philosopher David Chalmers. And this hit in his I think I don't what he argues is that if and when we know every single physical fact that can be known about the brain, we will still not be able to account for how phenomenal consciousness arises from the brain. Phenomenal consciousness being, it's a term that's, you kind of know it, but it's hard to define, but it's the aboutness. So when the idea is that, a simple organism like, a paramecium, a single-celled organism or something, it will, but if you have like food or something it's supposed to go towards, there'll be a chemical reaction gradient that it'll just go towards it. That will do the job perfectly fine. We don't presume that he's actually thinking, food, that'll be really good, I'll go over there and eat it. Whereas we have thoughts, we can ponder, we have representations, we can remember something, we can talk about things that we've never, like someone I've seen, something I can talk about it to you, and then there will be something in your head that will form, that will give you an idea of what I'm talking about. It's the aboutness, or there is something like it is, another term that's used. So the hard problem is presumably that this is not a question that can be answered by the law, by just continuing on the way we're going. And then there's also the whole, and so that's that's one of the stronger arguments in favor of it, is that we just, and it's not like we really have a really good idea what we're even looking for. Like, it's hard to imagine what would even a good theory or good model that can account for phenomenal consciousness would be. We don't, I mean, this is recently, I think, in the news, that David Chalmers actually won a bet with Christoph Koch, I think.
With who?
Neuroscience. I think 25 years ago, Christoph Koch had said, by 2023, we will have a good understanding of the physical aspects of the brain, that not even necessarily the whole story, but just we will have like pinpointed, okay, that's the conscious network, or that's whatever. And I think they bet a case of wine or something, and Chalmers won. And they've renewed the bet for another 25 years. So we'll still stay tuned.
Yes.
So that is the main counter to what you say. Okay, we have all these strong things that correlate, but that doesn't quite, correlation does not mean causation, right? There are changes in the brain, changes in, one of my favorite correlations is is something called the Jennifer Aniston brain neuron that apparently you can locate. I don't know if you've heard that, where everyone, if someone's thinking of Jennifer Aniston, there's a particular neuron. That's not the same neuron in every person, but you can, if you see this one neuron firing, you know they're thinking of Jennifer Aniston. But just Jennifer, not Jennifer Aniston with Brad Pitt. That's
another one.
So that's kind of what you're saying, that you can tell what the thought is just by looking at the brain. So that's a strong, but still, how do you get the idea of Jennifer Aniston from firings in the brain? And that
only applies to Americans or viewers of Friends.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know. Yeah, like it's not like, you know, if you take someone from a deserted island, from a primitive island where they don't have TV, and then you stimulate this, they'll suddenly have an image of this blonde woman with a haircut. Yeah. So, and then here, I'm not a philosopher, and I find, when you really delve into it, I find the whole philosophy of mind literature very difficult. So I try to kind of dummy it down and kind of do a simplified version of it, kind of for my level of understanding. So the way I think of it, there's sort of two main branches. There's physicalism or monism, which is basically the brain that's the whole story. Everything about consciousness can be accounted for by just understanding the brain. So I think of it like, what are we in terms of philosophy of mind? Like, again, with the case of wine, if and when we figure out consciousness, which school of philosophical thought will win? How would we know who gets the case of wine? So I would say, for the physicalists or the monists, if we've just kind of continued on the path we're going, you know, studying brain function, maybe coming up with better tests, better resolution, and we'll figure it out. It's just the stuff we already know about, just we know about it a bit more. We understand it better. And there's no ghost in the machine or anything. So that's monism or physicalism. And then there's subtypes of that, like, is consciousness, is the mind identical with the brain, or is it emergent from the brain, or is the mind just a fiction? Like, when we know everything, will we no longer speak of desires and thoughts and wishes and emotions? These are just folk psychology that we use because it's the best we can do, because we had no clue what we were actually talking about. And then we will no longer use those terms, because we'll just talk about, well, my hypothalamus is firing, so I need a good shot, or a shot of alcohol to calm it down or whatever.
Yeah. Well, if I was a gambling man,
those subtypes are just like, that's very inside baseball for me. Like, I can kind of maybe figure it out, but I figure it doesn't matter. Like, which one of those is right, it would be right. They all come down to, it's all from the brain. Like, I know, is inside baseball, maybe that not be a term that you use.
Can I ask you?
No.
But
Faisal, I want to ask, so I like that you say you have to dumb it down, because these philosophical conversations about consciousness also, they just break my brain. But I want to take it even one level down, and I just want to ask you whether you think we have a soul or not, because I think that is a question separate from the whole problem of consciousness, because I can absolutely see that the problem of consciousness is still a problem, in the sense that I don't think we have a proper definition, and I can see that we have loads of work to do still. But if I have to boil everything,
she's frozen.
Yes, it's very cold. I think that the run-of-the-mill dualists the question for me is, do we have a soul? Do we have something that exists outside of our bodies when our brains die? Well,
Oh dear.
Actually, no, I have two. I have the inner soles in my shoes. Uh, that's about as far as the soul, in my opinion, goes. And the idea of a soul, to me, if you speak of a soul as something that exists somewhere, somehow, when our brains die, do you think we have a soul?
My opinion is no, but I like the thing is, see, the way I approach it is there, like I say, there's these philosophical arguments, and they go on, and as philosophers will do, like I think in terms of as a philosophical position, I have no idea which of these is true by the standards by which philosophy is practiced, because philosophy is not science, and so it's not something that, there are assumptions in science and there are methodologies in science that are not used in philosophy. So what the way I take it is, do the dualists bring anything to the table that can help us? Like if we think, okay, let's presume for the sake of argument that there is a soul. Now what?
That's an interesting approach.
What does this? Is there something that we can explain with the soul that we can understand if there was a soul that we can't understand now? And that's kind of where I find they fall on their face. I just don't see any of, like they can say, oh, all these mysteries and difficult questions and hard problems and difficult problems, and they say it's a bit like the creationists, and who they will say, well, how did life begin? You guys have no idea about abiogenesis. You still don't. So God did it. And I say, okay, God did it. Show me.
How?
You don't have, it's not physical, it's not chemical, so you don't have to do it in those terms, but show me the equivalent of how the ways we do answer the things we know in science. For instance, we don't know where life began, but we know everything in pretty good idea how it happened, like how we started from the first cell to all the diversity of life. We know down to the molecular level the process by which that happens. What do you have that's in whatever methodology you're using that is as an explanation to the same extent? And it's just not there. Like there is, where is the dualist research program? What are they coming up with? There is some genuine, I think, good faith science that people have done to try to support the existence of the soul, and that comes down to the way that what they try to do is show that there is mind activity happening in the absence of brain activity. And so a lot of what they will talk about are like near-death experiences, clinical death, out-of-body experiences. And what they will claim is that there are people who will have a cardiac arrest. And then they have this experience that they can remember. They'll say they remember floating above their bodies, looking down, hearing what the doctors were saying. They might remember particular details. They might recognize, like after they're resuscitated, they'll say, "Hey, thanks for taking, you're a great." They'll recognize people like that.
So my response would be, you weren't dead then, were you?
Exactly. That's the difficult part, is to show that. See, people often confuse clinical death with brain death. So clinical death is when you're unconscious, you look dead, you're good, your eyes are, you're pale, pretty much you're dead. You're not quite dead. You don't have any heart. Your heart,
The Princess Bride. You've watched
but
the Princess Bride.
Your brain is still doing stuff.
Yeah.
And also, and even if you don't just go like okay, I'm alive. Oh, I'm dead. Oh, I'm alive again. There's a transition where your brain is still functioning and not functioning, then it's functioning not so great, and then it's functioning a bit better, then you come out. So the difficulty where they failed is in showing that what these memories, these experiences are not just, memories that people have patched together later or earlier than when they were unconscious, or that, even though you're lying there looking dead, you're still taking things in. You're still, your brain is still processing stuff. So
or they were not just making stuff up in order to become.
Or you fill in the blanks. As again, that's something we definitely know, that you tell people,
There was this
experiment,
boy.
a known fact that you will, people will have very vivid and convincing recollections of things that are not at all what happened. And people know, like you say, oh, they were all anxious, they used the paddles and my body jumped up and they injected stuff in my veins. You've seen enough medical TV shows to know what's happening. There was, like I said, there are some good faith. There was a study, the AWARE study, is a group that I can't remember the name of the investigator, but he's a guy who's quite interested in. I think he believes there is a soul, and he really wants to prove that it exists. And it was actually a pretty well designed study. That what they did was they would have in these resuscitation suites, they put like cards on shelves high up on the wall. You've probably heard of this, where where people, like the patient, would not be able to see them, but if they, if their soul left their body and they were floating up and around the ceiling towards heaven, they'd be able to. It's an attempt. It was a good faith attempt. It didn't work, and they didn't have a single person who said, "Oh, and there's a letter A on the." Now, if I were dead and going off to heaven, I'm not going to say, wow, look at that little card with the letter A. Wow, that's the most mind-blowing thing I've ever seen. I certainly remember that. So maybe it wasn't the greatest study, but at least it was an attempt, and it didn't. And what's kind of disturbing about that for me, like I say, I'm saying it's a good faith attempt, but the thing is, they didn't report when they actually reported the results. They didn't make any mention of that. And it was again kind of hyped up as, scientific study shows the existence of the soul, because they had one or two people who said, yeah, I remember, I saw them, they were very anxious and pumping my chest, and so yeah. So
well,
and yeah, I don't know. The thing came to the end of that thread.
The thing is, this is so interesting. I don't want to stop, but we have run out of our hour. So I'm hoping.
I had all this stuff to talk about, but this was great.
And this stuff too. I'm hoping that you'll agree to come back another day and continue. And Tertia's done her doodling.
That's lovely.
But I'm sorry, I'm going to be strict about the hour.
It's the free thought hour. We in our business, our hours are 46 minutes, because that's the minimum number of hours you can work, see a patient to bill for a full hour. So that's what we consider an hour. So you've actually given me 14 minutes bonus. So that's great.
And in American TV, an hour is 38 minutes, because the rest is adverts.
That's right. Yes. Okay. Well, this I would certainly love to, if you'll have me again. I would love to continue or have another discussion. And this has been very enjoyable. And I hope
that's wonderful. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And thank you, everybody.
Do I stay? Do I stay here, or do I have to log out?
You can stay here. I'll end the show. We can continue to chat afterwards, but I'll stop the streaming. Okay. So thank you very much, and thank you for watching, anybody who does watch this in the future, and goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone.